The sun was setting over the quiet suburban neighborhood, casting a golden glow on the streets. It was a peaceful scene, the kind you'd expect to find in a postcard. Children playing on their bikes, neighbors chatting by their mailboxes, and families winding down after a long day. Among them was Clara, a young pregnant woman, sitting in her wheelchair on the porch of her small, neatly kept house. Her husband Daniel, an FBI agent, was still at work. As he often was, Clara had grown used to his late hours. Despite her condition, she was fiercely independent and refused to let her wheelchair define her life. Clara was on her way to the local park for some fresh air when the first shadow of trouble appeared. She had just made her way down the ramp Daniel had built for her when a police car pulled up to the curb. The officer inside, a man with a stern expression and mirrored sunglasses, stepped out and approached her. His demeanor was cold, almost dismissive, as though he had already decided she was a problem. Clara, though confused, greeted him politely, unsure of what could have prompted his sudden interest. "Ma'am, what are you doing out here?" the officer asked, his tone clipped. "I'm just heading to the park," Clara replied, her voice calm but firm. "Is there a problem?" The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked her up and down, his gaze lingering uncomfortably long on her wheelchair. "Do you live here?" he finally asked. "Yes, I do," Clara said, gesturing toward her house. "Why?" The officer ignored her question. "I need to see some ID," he said, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. Clara's heart began to race. She had heard stories of encounters like this, but she never imagined she'd find herself in one. "I don't understand," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Why do you need my ID? I haven't done anything wrong." The officer's expression hardened. "Don't make this difficult, ma'am," he said, stepping closer. "Show me your ID." Clara hesitated, unsure of what to do. She knew she hadn't broken any laws, but the officer's aggressive tone made her uneasy. Slowly, she reached into her bag, careful not to make any sudden movements. She handed him her driver's license, her hands shaking slightly. The officer snatched it from her and examined it for what felt like an eternity. "You live here, huh?" he said finally, his tone dripping with skepticism. "You don't look like you belong in this neighborhood." Clara's chest tightened at his words. She had lived in this neighborhood for years, and while she had experienced her share of microaggressions, this was different. This was blatant, unapologetic prejudice. "I don't know what you mean by that," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "This is my home." The officer handed her ID back with a smirk that made her skin crawl. "We'll see about that," he said. "Stay here." Before Clara could respond, the officer walked back to his car and began speaking into his radio. Clara felt a knot of anxiety form in her stomach. She reached for her phone and dialed Daniel's number, her fingers trembling. The call went straight to voicemail. Of course, he was in a meeting. He had told her as much before he left that morning. She left a quick message, explaining what was happening, and hung up. When the officer returned, his demeanor had shifted. He was no longer just cold. He was openly hostile. "I'm going to need you to come with me," he said. "What? Why?" Clara asked, her voice rising in panic. "I haven't done anything wrong." "You're resisting a lawful order," he snapped. "Now, are you going to come quietly, or do I need to make this harder than it has to be?" Clara's mind raced. She knew she had done nothing wrong, but the officer's escalating aggression left her feeling trapped. "I'm not resisting," she said, her voice trembling. "I just want to know why you're doing this." Without warning, the officer grabbed the handles of her wheelchair and began pushing her toward his car. Clara cried out in protest, struggling against his grip, but he was too strong. The neighbors, who had been watching from a distance, began to gather, their murmurs growing louder. Some pulled out their phones, recording the unfolding scene. "Let me go," Clara shouted, tears streaming down her face. "This is wrong." "Keep quiet," the officer barked, his grip tightening. "You brought this on yourself." At that moment, one of the neighbors stepped forward, her phone held high. "You can't do this," he yelled. "She hasn't done anything wrong." The officer glared at her. "Step back," he warned. "This doesn't concern you." But the woman didn't move. "It concerns all of us," she said, her voice unwavering. "We're not going to stand by and watch you abuse your power." The tension in the air was palpable. Clara could feel her heart pounding in her chest as the crowd began to close in. She looked around, desperate for someone to intervene, but no one dared to challenge the officer directly. Then, Out of the corner of her eye, she saw a familiar car pull up to the curb. Daniel stepped out, his face a mask of controlled fury. He took one look at the scene before him and strode forward, his FBI badge already in hand. "Let her go," Daniel said, his voice calm but firm. The officer froze, his hands still on Clara's wheelchair. "And who are you?" he demanded, his tone dripping with defiance. Daniel held up his badge. "Special Agent Daniel Hayes, FBI. And that's my wife you're assaulting." The color drained from the officer's face as he realized the gravity of the situation. But before he could respond, Daniel stepped closer, his eyes locked on the officer's. "You've got a lot of explaining to do," he said, his voice low and menacing. "But first, you're going to let her go." The officer hesitated for a moment before releasing Clara's wheelchair. She immediately wheeled herself away, her hands shaking. Daniel knelt beside her, his expression softening as he checked her over. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. Clara nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I'm okay now," she whispered. But as Daniel stood and turned back to the officer, his expression hardened once more. "We're not done here," he said. "Not by a long shot." Daniel stood his ground, his badge still visible as the crowd around them watched in stunned silence. The officer, visibly shaken but trying to maintain an air of authority, stammered out a half-hearted explanation. "I didn't know she was. I was just following procedure." "Procedure?" Daniel interrupted, his voice sharp but controlled. "What part of your procedure includes manhandling a pregnant woman in a wheelchair without any justification?" His words cut through the tension, and murmurs rippled through the crowd. The officer looked around nervously, aware that multiple phones were still recording. He cleared his throat, trying to regain some semblance of control. "There was a call about suspicious activity in the area. I was doing my job." Daniel's jaw tightened, and his eyes narrowed. "Suspicious activity? You approached my wife without cause, demanded her ID, and escalated the situation to the point of physical force. That's not doing your job. That's abuse of power." Clara, still shaken, reached out and touched Daniel's arm. "Daniel, let's just go home," she said softly, her voice trembling. But Daniel shook his head, his eyes never leaving the officer. "This isn't just about us, Clara. If this is how he treats you, imagine what he's done to others who didn't have someone to stand up for them." The weight of his words hung in the air, and the officer's defiance began to waver. Another squad car pulled up, and 2 more officers stepped out, their expressions a mix of confusion and concern. They quickly assessed the scene, their eyes darting between Daniel, Clara, and the first officer. "What's going on here?" one of them asked, his tone cautious. Daniel stepped forward, pulling out his phone to show them his credentials. "Special Agent Daniel Hayes, FBI. This officer assaulted my wife without cause, and I want to file a formal complaint." The second officer's face paled as he glanced at his colleague. "We'll take it from here, sir," he said, motioning for the first officer to step aside. The crowd, sensing the situation was under control, began to disperse, though many lingered, clearly still recording. As Daniel helped Clara back into their car, his mind raced. This incident wasn't just a personal attack. It was a symptom of a much larger problem. He knew he couldn't let it go, not just for Clara's sake but for the countless others who had likely suffered in silence. Over the next few days, Daniel began to dig deeper. He requested access to the officer's personnel file, using his FBI connections to navigate the bureaucratic red tape. What he found was alarming. Multiple complaints of excessive force, racial profiling, and unprofessional conduct. All swept under the rug with minimal consequences. It was a pattern Daniel had seen before, and it infuriated him. Clara, meanwhile, struggled with the emotional aftermath of the incident. She couldn't shake the fear that gripped her every time she left the house. Even routine errands felt overwhelming, and she found herself looking over her shoulder, wondering if she was being watched. Daniel tried to comfort her, but he knew that words alone couldn't erase what had happened. One evening, as they sat together in their living room, Clara turned to Daniel, her eyes filled with determination. "I don't want to feel powerless anymore," she said. "If you're going to fight this, I want to help." Daniel nodded, pride and admiration swelling in his chest. "We'll do it together," he promised. They began by reaching out to the local community, connecting with advocacy groups and civil rights organizations. Clara shared her story at town hall meetings, her voice shaking but resolute as she described what had happened. Her bravery inspired others to come forward, and soon, A pattern of misconduct within the police department began to emerge. At the same time, Daniel worked behind the scenes to build a case. He compiled witness statements, gathered video evidence, and coordinated with internal affairs to ensure the officer in question would face accountability. But as they pushed forward, they encountered resistance at every turn. Bureaucratic delays, stonewalling, and even subtle intimidation tactics made it clear that not everyone wanted the truth to come out. One night, as Daniel was poring over documents in his home office, Clara came in with a worried expression. "Daniel, I think someone's been following me," she said quietly. Daniel's heart sank. "What do you mean?" "I've noticed the same car parked near the house several times," she said, "and today, when I went to the store, I saw it again. It feels off." Daniel's protective instincts kicked in immediately. He knew that pushing for justice often came with risks, but hearing that Clara felt unsafe in her own home was almost too much to bear. "I'll take care of it," he said, his voice firm. "No one is going to intimidate us." The next day, Daniel installed security cameras around their property and reached out to a trusted colleague at the FBI for advice. Together, they devised a plan to monitor the situation and ensure Clara's safety. But the incident only strengthened Daniel's resolve. If someone was trying to scare them into backing down, it meant they were on the right track. As the weeks went on, the case gained momentum. The local news picked up the story, and soon it was making headlines across the country. Public pressure mounted, and the police department found itself under intense scrutiny. The officer who had assaulted Clara was placed on administrative leave, but Daniel and Clara knew that wasn't enough. They wanted systemic change, not just a temporary fix. Tensions reached a boiling point when a group of protesters gathered outside the police station, demanding accountability. Clara and Daniel stood at the front of the crowd, their presence a powerful reminder of what was at stake. As they raised their voices alongside the community, Clara felt a renewed sense of strength. For the first time since the incident, she felt like she was reclaiming her power. But just as it seemed they were making progress, an unexpected twist threatened to derail everything. A key piece of evidence, a crucial video that showed the officer's actions in detail, suddenly went missing. It was a devastating blow. And for a moment, it seemed like the system had won. Daniel refused to give up. "They can try to cover it up," he said, his voice steady, "but the truth always finds a way out." And with that, the stakes were higher than ever, as the fight for justice reached a critical turning point. Daniel sat in his car in the dimly lit parking lot outside the FBI field office, staring at the empty screen of his phone. The missing video had shaken him, but he wasn't ready to accept defeat. He thought back to Clara's courage, her unwavering determination to stand up not just for herself, but for others who have faced the same injustices. That image of her, vulnerable yet so powerful, was enough to reignite his resolve. He took a deep breath and dialed a number. "Marcus," he said when his colleague picked up, "I need your help. Someone's tampering with evidence, and I think it goes deeper than we thought." Marcus, an old friend and seasoned FBI investigator, didn't hesitate. "Send me everything you have," he said. "We'll figure this out." Over the next few days, Daniel worked around the clock with Marcus and a small team of trusted allies. They scoured digital archives, traced files, and pieced together a trail of suspicious activity within the local police department. What they uncovered was worse than Daniel had anticipated: a network of officers colluding to cover up misconduct, using every tool at their disposal to protect their own. Meanwhile, Clara continued her work with the community. She spoke at rallies and connected with journalists, ensuring that the story remained in the public eye. The support from neighbors and strangers alike lifted her spirits, and she found herself growing more confident with each passing day. But the threats persisted: anonymous calls, strange cars lingering near their home. Clara knew the risks, but she refused to let fear silence her. Then, a breakthrough came. Marcus managed to recover fragments of the missing video from a backup server, enough to clearly show the officer's actions that day. Armed with this evidence, Daniel prepared to confront the police department head-on, but he knew he couldn't stop there. The systemic corruption they had uncovered demanded more than a single victory. It called for sweeping reform. Daniel and Clara decided to take the fight public. They held a press conference, standing side by side as Daniel laid out the evidence. "This isn't just about one bad officer," he said, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "It's about a culture that allows abuse of power to thrive. My wife was brave enough to stand up, and now it's time for all of us to demand accountability." The reaction was immediate. The press conference went viral, sparking a nationwide conversation about police accountability and systemic reform. Calls for an independent investigation into the local police department grew louder, and public officials could no longer ignore the outcry. As the investigation unfolded, more stories of misconduct came to light. Officers who had once operated with impunity were now facing scrutiny, and some began to cooperate in exchange for leniency. The officer who had attacked Clara was formally charged with assault and misconduct, and Daniel ensured that his trial would be fair but uncompromising. But the real climax came during a tense city council meeting, where Daniel, Clara, and members of the community presented their demands for change. The room was packed, the air electric with anticipation. Clara spoke first, her voice clear and unwavering. "This isn't just about what happened to me," she said. "It's about making sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." Daniel followed, outlining a detailed plan for reform that included mandatory de-escalation training, independent oversight, and a zero-tolerance policy for abuse of power. The council members, many of whom had been resistant to change, found themselves facing overwhelming public pressure. By the end of the meeting, they had no choice but to commit to immediate action. In the weeks that followed, change began to take root. The corrupt officers were held accountable, and new leadership within the police department pledged to rebuild trust with the community. Clara and Daniel became symbols of resilience and justice, their story inspiring others to speak out against injustice in their own communities. One quiet evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, Clara turned to Daniel and smiled. "We did it," she said softly. Daniel nodded, taking her hand in his. "You did it," he replied. "You stood up when it mattered most." Clara looked out at the street, now bustling with life. "I just hope it makes a difference," she said. "It already has," Daniel assured her, "and it will keep making a difference, because people like you won't stop fighting." Their journey hadn't been easy, and the scars, both physical and emotional, would take time to heal. But as they sat there, hand in hand, they knew they had done something that mattered. They had turned pain into purpose, fear into strength, and injustice into a catalyst for change. And for the first time in what felt like forever, they felt at peace.